Hi, I'm Tyler Holmes, a developer with Fishtank Consulting, and today we're going to be looking at how you can build complex forms and kind of architect them out before you start developing to work better with Sitecore. So we're going to be going over a few different things today, mainly when you can use this method, how you can understand different code segregation and understanding the overall user flow, the file structure, and we're going to go over Sitecore pages and experience editor, some potential problems, and then some solutions to how you can solve those problems. So when should you use this method? There's quite a few different reasons or times when you should use this method, mainly when you have a complex design. So think about anything that has a lot of different pages and steps. So your designer or client is giving you this large multi-page complex form. Or when you can tell that each page is going to contain a medium to large amount of code, right? So you've got all these different steps of the form, and then you can tell that, like, okay, step 1 is going to have a lot of code, step 2 is going to have a lot of code. Another scenario is when you maybe need to make a lot of unique API calls between each step, right? If you're making multiple different API calls, this is a great method to use. And if you want to keep the code organized, readable, and structured, then this is also another great time to use this method. So understanding the code segregation. So here I have just an example form taken off Dribble. This is like a pretty generalized common form that you might see in a project that you're working on. You can see it's got multiple different steps there at the top, and we're currently on step 2. So everything here within this red box here would be one component. This would be like the parent component. So this would be one TSX file, which is compile everything inside this, right? This would include step 1, 2, and 3. Then as we start to segregate the code a bit more, you can kind of see here now we have a bunch of purple blocks. Each item here, each purple square would be a subcomponent inside of our main primary component, the red component, right? So inside our red component, we now have a component for the navigation at the top, that dispatchable generator toggle, the import toolkit area, everything. These would be their own components in the run files. And then inside these purple components, we'd also have these green components, right? So that import from toolkit could be its own component. The fuel type and fuel units can be its own component inside the parent component. And then the generator settings, you can build one little input block there and then have it repeat, go through an array to display them all. But again, that would be its own subcomponent. It would be entirely separated. Now you kind of have this like tree structure of how the code's built out between the different components. So how does the user flow work? Well, I mean, the step 1 is that the user's going to come to the website and Sitecore is going to send the data for each individual page directly to your website. And the user's then going to navigate to our complex form, right? So our custom form here. Once the user arrives at the form, they're going to essentially get only the HTML sent to them from step 1, right? We're not going to send them all of the steps. We'll just send them step 1 and it's loaded immediately, right? And then we can also have it set here. So step 2 is going to be conditionally loaded. So step 2A won't be loaded if the user sent to step 2B, and step 2B won't be loaded if the user sent to step 2A. So the idea is the user fills out the form. There's something in step 1 that directs them to the 2A flow. So then all that code that's in 2B is no longer sent to the user. This improves performance, reduces the load on the user's system for client-side work, and reduces the amount of data that's being sent from your backend to the client. So not only is it better for the client's performance, but it's also better for your server. You're not sending unnecessary data, right? And then step 3 is, since in this scenario, step 2 and step 2A and step 2B both go to step 3. Step 3 is just lazy loaded. So the idea of conditionally loading and lazy loading is that if the user backs out of the form or stops in step 2, then that data for step 3 isn't loaded. Once again, relieving data for you on your servers. That's kind of the idea of making every step prior to step 3 faster by only loading the step information when you need it. File structure. So how can we kind of plan and lay out our code as we go? So this is kind of like a rough example of a Sitecore tree here. So we have our component folder, and inside this we have our parent, our complex form. This is the rendering that we connect directly into Sitecore, right? This is our parent component. So this is what the rendering will be created in Sitecore. And then we also have all these different child components. So we have inside a secondary component folder, so I've named this component children. This is so that these items are not indexed by Sitecore. And then we have all of our different subcomponents inside of this. So we have a couple different forms here. We have our complex form, and then we have a step 1, 2, and 3 folder. And inside each of those step 1, 2, and 3 folders, we have the child component step 1. So this is where all that the main code would go for step 1. And then any children that are inside step 1 can go inside a components folder specifically designated inside the same folder as the child. So in this scenario, it is the grandchild component. Now, to get a better idea of how the code might actually look and how it's kind of laid out, here's some example code that I kind of quickly whipped up to show you guys maybe a more visual example of what it might look like. So we have this use effect here at the top. So basically we're looking for a query string in the URL that checks to see what stage the user's in. And then it sets the form stage state to the correct value, depending on what the query state is. And then in the return statement here, we can just return the individual step depending on which form state the user's on. So this allows us again to lazy load this user, next dynamic to import these components and only load the steps when they're needed. Next, I'm going to show you code is editable and works well with Sitecore pages and Experience Editor, right? So when could this be a problem? This is a common issue when the user interacts with part of the form that affects something else on the page, right? So if the user inputs a certain value that makes other fields appear, that's a problem. You start thinking about that kind of stuff before you start coding, right? Or maybe another point is just the design in general is just hard to accommodate inside Sitecore pages just because of all the different options that are present on the page. So how do you solve this? Well, one of the main things is you want to add early returns to anywhere inside your calls. So if you're making a use effect call or a function or a callback, you can add this if Sitecore context page editing value and just do an early return. So this stops the code from running if the user is in editing mode. This will stop any API calls from running or anything like that, and can really help clean up the amount of errors that happen on the Sitecore pages side. And then inside our return statement, depending on how complex the code is, and if you need to rebuild or redesign the Sitecore pages to make sure all the fields are editable, you can just wrap your simplified version for Experience Editor and Sitecore pages inside a simple ternary in the return statement. So that means everything inside of the page editing is true there, that simplified version for EE and Sitecore pages. That's just going to be pretty much a layout of all the inputs. It doesn't even need to look the same as long as the user is able to go in and edit all the values. And then the else condition in the bottom there would just be the actual form the user would interact with. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you've learned something, and hopefully this will help you build better forms in the future and kind of architect out better and more complex forms. I also have an article on this exact topic. If you want to look in the description, you can go and read that, and kind of maybe that'll give you a bit more detail, a bit more steps on how to work in and work through architecting your complex form for either your client or your own website.